Something strange is happening inside the Cleveland Browns quarterback room. Coaches are choosing their words carefully, veterans are hinting at something behind the scenes, and fans are starting to notice the shift. Is this really an open competition, or are the Browns quietly preparing Shedeur Sanders to become Cleveland's next franchise quarterback? The story around the Cleveland Browns quarterback room was supposed to be simple. At least that's what the public was told. Coaches spoke about competition, reporters repeated the same message, and fans were led to believe that every quarterback on the roster had an equal shot at earning the starting role. But inside the building, the conversation may have been far more complicated. When training sessions began, the expectation was that multiple quarterbacks would battle for control of the offense. Analysts discussed experience, system fit, and leadership. On paper, several players seemed capable of stepping into the role. But almost immediately, subtle signals began to appear that made some observers question whether the competition was truly wide open. One of the biggest reasons for that attention was Shedeur Sanders. The young quarterback arrived with enormous hype, not just because of his college production, but also because of the spotlight that has followed him for years. From his time playing under Dillon Sanders, expectations have always been massive. Some fans believed the Browns brought him in simply to develop slowly. Others suspected something much bigger. Early practice reports only fueled the speculation. Beat writers began mentioning how often Sanders was getting reps with key offensive players. Meanwhile, analysts on television debated whether the team was quietly preparing him for a larger role sooner than expected. None of this was officially confirmed, but it was enough to start conversations across social media. Veteran players also added another layer to the situation. A few comments during interviews hinted that Sanders had already gained respect inside the locker room. That kind of endorsement matters in the NFL. Quarterbacks don't just need talent, they need the trust of the players around them. And according to some reports, Sanders was quickly building that trust. Still, the coaching staff stayed careful with their messaging. Every press conference repeated the same theme: the job had not been decided yet. Competition, preparation, and patience were the words used most often. Publicly, nothing had changed. But fans began noticing the pattern. When a rookie receives increased attention, more reps, and quiet praise from veterans, it usually means the organization sees real potential. Whether that potential turns into a starting job immediately is another story entirely. And that's where things started to get interesting. Because while the Browns kept insisting the quarterback room was wide open, the subtle signs suggested something else might be developing behind the scenes. But that wasn't the full picture. During a routine media session, Kevin Stefanski stepped up to the podium expecting the usual round of questions. Reporters asked about off-season preparation, team chemistry, and the progress of the quarterback room. On the surface, it looked like a standard press conference, but one particular moment quickly caught the attention of analysts and fans watching closely. When the discussion turned toward the quarterback competition, Stefanski gave the expected response at first. He emphasized preparation, repetition, and the idea that every player would need to earn their role. Coaches across the league often rely on this language during the offseason, especially when the depth chart isn't finalized. Nothing about his initial comments seemed unusual. But then the conversation shifted toward Shedeur Sanders, and that's when things became more interesting. A reporter asked about Sanders' development and how the rookie was adjusting to the speed of the professional game. Stefanski paused briefly before answering, choosing his words carefully. He talked about Sanders' work ethic, his confidence in the pocket, and the way teammates had responded to his presence in early practices. Those comments alone weren't surprising. Coaches often praise young players during the early stages of their careers, but what raised eyebrows was the tone and detail in Stefanski's response. Instead of offering a short, generic answer, he spoke about Sanders' leadership qualities and how quickly he was absorbing the offensive system. For some observers, that level of praise suggested the coaching staff might already see something special developing. Almost immediately, sports talk shows and online analysts began dissecting the exchange. Some believed Stefanski was simply encouraging a young quarterback. Others felt the comments hinted at something more significant happening inside the organization. After all, public statements from a head coach rarely happen by accident. Every word can shape expectations, influence the locker room, and send signals to the media. Fans also noticed another subtle detail. While discussing other quarterbacks on the roster, Stefanski kept his answers brief and focused mostly on competition. But when Sanders' name came up, the explanation seemed longer and more enthusiastic. That difference didn't go unnoticed. Of course, none of it confirmed anything about the future starting job. Teams often praise multiple players throughout the offseason, and depth charts can change quickly once training camp begins. Still, moments like this tend to spark conversation because they reveal small clues about how coaches view their roster. And once those clues reach the public, speculation usually follows. Some fans began wondering whether Sanders was being prepared for a bigger opportunity sooner than expected. Others believed the Browns were simply trying to build confidence in a talented young player. Either way, that short exchange at the podium added another layer to the growing storyline surrounding Cleveland's quarterback situation. And what happened next only made the situation even more intriguing. Momentum can change quickly in the NFL. One week a quarterback looks like the clear favorite to climb the depth chart, and the next week the conversation starts shifting in a completely different direction. And lately, that seems to be happening around Dillon Gabriel. Not long ago, Gabriel was being talked about as one of the most intriguing young quarterbacks entering the league. His college career drew plenty of attention, especially during his time with the Oregon Ducks, where he showed off his quick release, mobility, and ability to operate fast-paced offenses. Those traits made some analysts believe he could transition smoothly into the modern NFL system. Early off-season discussions even suggested that Gabriel might quietly position himself as a serious contender in the quarterback room. Coaches value decision-making and experience, and Gabriel brought plenty of both after several productive college seasons. But recently, the narrative surrounding him has started to shift. Some analysts now believe the early excitement around Gabriel has cooled slightly. That doesn't necessarily mean anything dramatic has happened. In many cases, it simply reflects how competitive the NFL environment can be. When multiple quarterbacks are fighting for attention, one player's momentum can fade as another begins to capture headlines. And that's exactly where the conversation starts circling back to Shedeur Sanders. Reports from off-season workouts and early team activities suggest that Sanders has been drawing increasing attention from coaches and teammates. Some observers claim his confidence and leadership presence have stood out in meetings and practice sessions. Those types of impressions can matter more than people realize, especially during the early stages of a quarterback competition. Meanwhile, Gabriel's situation appears a little quieter. That silence doesn't necessarily mean he's struggling. In fact, many young quarterbacks go through phases where they simply focus on learning the playbook and adapting to the professional speed of the game. Development at the NFL level rarely follows a straight line. However, in the world of media coverage and fan discussion, quiet periods can sometimes be interpreted as lost momentum. Some fans believe Gabriel still has the tools to surprise people once preseason action begins. Others think the spotlight is gradually shifting toward other quarterbacks who are generating more buzz around the organization. At this stage, it's important to remember that much of the off-season narrative is built on limited information. Practice performances, internal evaluations, and coaching decisions usually remain behind closed doors. What the public sees is often just a small piece of the bigger picture. Still, the perception of momentum can influence how people view a competition. Right now, the conversation around Gabriel feels less intense than it did earlier. And when that happens in the NFL media cycle, attention usually moves somewhere else. And in this case, that shifting spotlight is beginning to land firmly on someone else. One of the most interesting parts of this entire situation isn't just the competition itself, it's the quiet signals coming from the coaching staff. Because in the NFL, coaches rarely reveal their full plans publicly, but their preferences often show up in subtle ways. And lately, some observers believe those signals may be pointing toward Shedeur Sanders. At first glance, the quarterback battle might appear wide open. Teams usually say all the right things about competition, development, and giving every player a fair opportunity. But behind the scenes, coaching staffs are constantly evaluating which quarterback fits their system the best. Arm talent matters, accuracy matters, but decision-making, leadership, and command of the offense often matter even more. And that's where Sanders has reportedly started to separate himself in the conversation. During his time playing for the Colorado Buffaloes, Sanders built a reputation for being extremely comfortable in high-pressure situations. Even when defenses were collapsing the pocket, or when the offense struggled around him, he showed an ability to stay composed and deliver accurate throws. That kind of calm presence is something coaches tend to value highly when evaluating quarterbacks for the next level. But it's not just about game tape. Some reports suggest Sanders has also impressed people with how quickly he processes information during meetings and film sessions. Learning an NFL playbook isn't easy. Systems can be complex, adjustments change constantly, and quarterbacks are expected to understand not just their own responsibilities, but everyone else's as well. When a young quarterback shows he can absorb that information quickly, coaches take notice. Leadership is another factor that often influences these decisions. Quarterbacks are expected to command the huddle, communicate clearly, and earn the trust of teammates. Sanders spent years doing exactly that at Colorado, where he often carried the expectations of the entire program on his shoulders. Some fans believe that experience helped him develop the kind of confidence that naturally translates into a leadership role. Of course, none of this guarantees anything. The NFL is full of talented quarterbacks who impressed early but still had to prove themselves once real competition began. Preseason games, training camp battles, and practice performance will ultimately shape how the depth chart develops. Still, it's hard to ignore the way conversations around Sanders have gradually grown louder. Analysts, fans, and even former players have started discussing the possibility that he might have an edge in certain areas that coaches prioritize. And when those conversations start building momentum, they tend to influence the narrative surrounding a quarterback competition. Meanwhile, other quarterbacks in the room, including players like Dillon Gabriel, are still working to prove their own case. Talent alone doesn't decide these battles. Fit, preparation, and timing can all play a role in shaping the final outcome. So while the competition remains open on paper, the subtle signs from the coaching staff have sparked an interesting debate among fans and analysts alike. Because if those signals are accurate, the coaching staff may already be leaning in a particular direction. And if that's true, the entire quarterback conversation could shift much sooner than people expect. The quarterback conversation didn't begin this year. In many ways, it has been quietly building since the final months of the previous coaching era. When leadership changes inside an NFL organization, the ripple effects are rarely immediate. But over time, those decisions begin to shape the future of the roster, especially at the most important position on the field. Under the previous staff, the approach to the quarterback room was often described as cautious. Development was emphasized, but bold long-term commitments were harder to spot. Some analysts believed the team preferred stability over risk, even if that meant delaying a clear decision about who the future starter might be. That strategy worked in some moments, but it also left lingering questions about the long-term direction of the offense. And those questions didn't disappear when the coaching transition happened. When a new staff arrives, one of the first things they evaluate is the quarterback position. They review every snap, every practice report, and every decision made by the previous regime. Sometimes that review confirms the existing plan. Other times it leads to a completely different vision. Fans rarely see that process unfolding behind the scenes, but insiders often say it can dramatically reshape how a roster is built. This is where the discussion around Shedeur Sanders started to gain attention. His style of play, confident in the pocket, aggressive when necessary, and comfortable handling pressure, has sparked debates among analysts about whether he represents the type of quarterback a modern coaching staff might prioritize. During his time with the Colorado Buffaloes, Sanders demonstrated a willingness to push the ball downfield while still maintaining composure under difficult circumstances. Colorado's offensive line struggled at times, forcing him to deal with constant pressure. Yet he still managed to produce explosive moments that kept the offense competitive. Some fans believe that experience might actually strengthen his case in a professional system. Quarterbacks who learn to operate under chaos often develop instincts that translate well at the next level. Of course, that theory still needs to be proven against NFL defenses, which are faster, more complex, and far less forgiving. Meanwhile, others argue that the real question isn't just talent, it's philosophy. Every coaching staff has its own vision for how an offense should operate. Some prefer quick-release passers who emphasize timing and rhythm. Others want quarterbacks who can extend plays and create outside the structure of the system. When leadership changes, that philosophical shift can quietly redefine which players fit the future of the franchise. That's why conversations about the previous era continue to surface. Certain roster decisions made years earlier are now being re-examined through the lens of the current staff. Fans and analysts have begun asking whether those older evaluations still hold the same weight today. Sometimes the answer is yes, but sometimes a new regime sees something entirely different. And when that happens, the quarterback hierarchy can change faster than anyone expects. For now, the situation remains fluid. No official decision has been announced, and competition is still the message coming from inside the organization. But the shadow of the previous coaching era continues to influence how people interpret every development surrounding the quarterback position. Because in the NFL, the past never completely disappears. It simply waits in the background, shaping the choices that determine the future. Quarterback battles in the NFL are often presented as wide-open competitions. Coaches say all the right things, media members talk about earning the job, fans debate every throw in training camp. But behind the scenes, the truth is usually far more complicated. In many cases, the outcome of a quarterback battle is quietly leaning in one direction long before the public realizes it. That's because teams spend months, sometimes years, evaluating quarterbacks before they ever step onto a practice field for a supposed competition. By the time training camp arrives, coaching staffs have already studied film, personality traits, leadership styles, and how a player fits the offensive system. Every detail matters. Arm strength, decision-making, pocket awareness, and even how a quarterback commands a huddle all factor into the equation. So when the media begins framing the situation as a true open battle, insiders often know the reality is a bit different. Coaches rarely admit it publicly, but organizations usually have a preferred direction. The competition is real in terms of preparation and performance, yet the internal evaluations already carry significant weight. This dynamic becomes even more interesting when a high-profile young quarterback enters the conversation. Players like Shedeur naturally bring enormous attention with them. His college career with the Colorado Buffaloes put him in the national spotlight, and that spotlight doesn't disappear when discussions about the NFL begin. Sanders built a reputation for composure in chaotic situations. Colorado's offensive line struggled at times, forcing him to operate under constant pressure. Yet he still managed to deliver big plays, showing both patience and confidence in the pocket. For some evaluators, that resilience is one of his most intriguing traits. Quarterbacks who can maintain control when everything around them is collapsing often transition well to the professional level. But talent alone doesn't determine how a quarterback battle unfolds. Timing, organizational goals, and coaching philosophy all play major roles. If a team is rebuilding, they may prefer to develop a younger quarterback early. If they believe the roster is ready to compete immediately, they might lean toward experience and stability instead. That's why quarterback competitions sometimes feel unpredictable from the outside. Fans see highlights and preseason performances, but they rarely see the full evaluation process. Coaches watch how a quarterback studies film. They monitor how teammates respond to his leadership. They analyze every decision made during practice situations that never appear on television. And sometimes, those internal evaluations begin shaping the depth chart weeks before any official announcement is made. Reports from team insiders often hint at this reality. You might hear phrases like "the staff is impressed" or "the coaches like what they're seeing." Those small comments can signal a larger shift happening behind closed doors. Rumors begin circulating among reporters, and suddenly the narrative surrounding the competition starts to change. Of course, speculation always surrounds quarterback situations. Some fans believe the decision is already locked in. Others insist the competition remains completely open. The truth usually sits somewhere in the middle. Coaches want players to compete at the highest level, but they also want stability heading into the season. That balance is why quarterback battles rarely unfold exactly the way the public expects. A strong preseason performance can influence perception, but it doesn't erase months of internal evaluation. Coaches value consistency, preparation, and long-term potential just as much as highlight plays. And that's the hidden reality many fans don't realize. By the time the official starter is finally announced, the decision may feel sudden. But inside the building, that direction may have been forming quietly for weeks, sometimes even months, long before the public ever noticed. All of this raises a much bigger question for the future of the Cleveland Browns. Because if the voices inside the locker room are already leaning toward Shedeur, then the entire direction of the franchise could be quietly shifting right in front of everyone. Quarterback decisions define organizations in the NFL. They determine how a roster is built, how coaches design their offense, and ultimately how long a team remains competitive. When a young quarterback begins gaining support from veterans, that support carries serious weight. It means players believe he can lead them on Sundays. That's exactly why the comments from veterans have sparked so much conversation around the league. Players like Shelby Harris didn't just offer casual praise. He went out of his way to defend Sanders from narratives circulating in the media. Harris emphasized the one thing teammates respect above everything else in the NFL: work ethic. According to him, Sanders isn't walking into the building expecting anything to be handed to him. Instead, he's showing up early, studying the offense, and putting in the kind of effort veterans notice immediately. And in a professional locker room, that matters more than hype. Veterans have seen plenty of talented players come and go. Some arrive with massive expectations but struggle to handle the day-to-day grind of the league. Others quietly earn respect through preparation, humility, and leadership. When experienced players speak positively about a young quarterback's work habits, it usually means that quarterback is earning credibility behind the scenes. That's part of why the discussion surrounding Sanders keeps gaining momentum. But this situation becomes even more complicated when you consider the presence of Deshaun Watson on the roster. Watson's massive contract and past status as the franchise quarterback make any potential transition extremely sensitive. Teams don't simply move away from a player with that kind of investment overnight. However, the NFL has always been a results-driven league. If coaches believe a younger quarterback gives the team a better chance to succeed long-term, the conversation inevitably changes. Even if that shift happens gradually, it can still reshape the entire structure of the roster. And that's where the comments from players like Myles Garrett start to carry serious meaning. Garrett has consistently emphasized the importance of giving Sanders a real opportunity to prove himself. That doesn't guarantee Sanders will become the starter immediately, but it does suggest the locker room is paying close attention to his development. For a young quarterback, that kind of backing can be incredibly powerful. When teammates believe in the player leading the offense, the entire dynamic of a team changes. Offensive linemen protect harder, receivers run routes with more urgency, defenses feed off the energy of an offense they trust. Leadership in football is rarely forced, it grows naturally through performance and preparation. Still, none of this means the decision has already been made. Coaches will continue evaluating every option, including other quarterbacks potentially entering the competition. Analysts around the league have mentioned names like Anthony Richardson and Malik Willis in speculative discussions about quarterback movement. But those conversations remain largely hypothetical for now. Inside the building, the Browns' coaching staff is focused on development and competition. Reports suggest that offensive leadership, including figures like Todd Monken, will ultimately play a major role in determining how the quarterback situation unfolds. Offensive coordinators spend countless hours analyzing film, designing schemes, and evaluating how each quarterback executes their system. That evaluation process doesn't happen overnight. Every practice rep, every meeting, and every preseason snap contributes to the final decision. The coaching staff studies everything from decision-making under pressure to how quickly a quarterback processes defensive coverage. And sometimes, the smallest details end up determining who earns the starting job. What makes this situation especially fascinating is how early the conversation has begun. Usually, quarterback battles remain quiet until training camp. But in this case, the combination of media narratives, veteran comments, and fan speculation has accelerated the discussion. Some fans believe Sanders represents the future of the franchise. Others remain cautious, pointing out that the NFL is filled with talented young quarterbacks who struggled once the games truly mattered. Both perspectives are understandable. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear: Sanders has already captured attention inside the Browns organization. Whether it's his work ethic, his leadership style, or the flashes he's shown on the field, people around the team are watching closely. And if that momentum continues to build, the Browns could eventually find themselves facing a franchise-altering decision. Because when a locker room begins believing in a quarterback, that belief has a way of changing everything. So now, the real question facing the Cleveland Browns isn't just about talent, it's about timing. Because when a young quarterback like Shedeur Sanders begins earning respect inside the locker room, the conversation around a franchise can change faster than anyone expects. At first, the discussion around Sanders was mostly external. Analysts debated his draft value. Media personalities questioned whether the spotlight surrounding his famous father, Deion Sanders, helped or hurt his perception around the league. And some critics openly wondered if the hype would eventually become a distraction. But inside the building, the tone appears to be very different. Veterans aren't talking about hype, they're talking about work. Players like Shelby Harris have gone out of their way to highlight what they see every day behind closed doors. Early mornings, extra film sessions, time spent building relationships with teammates. These are the small details that rarely make headlines but often determine whether a quarterback truly earns the trust of a locker room. And trust in the NFL is everything. When teammates believe in their quarterback, it changes how the entire team operates. Offensive players feel more confident executing the game plan. Defenders feed off the momentum of an offense they trust to respond. Leadership becomes natural instead of forced. That's why the growing support around Sanders has caught the attention of fans. But the Browns' situation isn't simple. The presence of Deshaun Watson adds another layer of complexity to the conversation. Watson's contract, his experience, and the expectations tied to his arrival in Cleveland mean any potential transition at quarterback would be carefully evaluated. Teams rarely move quickly when that much investment is involved. Still, the NFL has always been a league driven by competition. Coaches evaluate performance constantly. Every practice rep matters. Every preseason drive becomes another piece of evidence in a much larger evaluation process. And sometimes the most important signals come from the players themselves. That's why comments from leaders like Myles Garrett have resonated with fans. Garrett hasn't declared Sanders the future outright. Instead, he's emphasized something more important, giving the young quarterback a legitimate opportunity to prove himself. That approach reflects how teams often handle these situations internally. No one is crowned the starter months before the season begins. The title has to be earned. Coaches study film, evaluate decision-making, and analyze how quarterbacks respond under pressure. They watch how players command the huddle. They observe how teammates react to leadership. Those moments reveal far more than statistics ever could. Of course, speculation around the league hasn't slowed down. Some analysts have mentioned other quarterbacks in potential competition scenarios, including Anthony Richardson and Malik Willis. Reports, rumors, and fan theories continue circulating online as people try to predict Cleveland's next move. But for now, most of that remains speculation. Inside the Browns organization, the focus is likely far more straightforward: evaluate every option and let the competition play out naturally. That process might take weeks, it might take months, sometimes it even stretches deep into training camp before a final decision is made. And during that time, narratives can shift quickly. One strong preseason performance can suddenly change expectations. One unexpected setback can force coaches to reconsider their plans. The NFL is full of stories where a quarterback battle turned dramatically in a matter of days. Which brings us back to Sanders. Right now, he sits at the center of one of the most intriguing storylines surrounding the Browns. A young quarterback with growing support inside the locker room. A franchise trying to navigate expectations, investments, and long-term planning. And a fan base watching every development closely. Some fans believe Sanders could eventually become the face of the franchise. Others remain cautious, pointing out that the transition from promising prospect to proven NFL starter is one of the toughest jumps in sports. Both perspectives make sense, because at this stage, the story is still unfolding. The only thing we know for certain is that the conversation around Sanders is no longer just about potential. It's about opportunity. And in the NFL, opportunity often becomes the moment that changes everything. So the real question now isn't whether Sanders has caught people's attention in Cleveland. The real question is what happens when he finally gets the chance to prove it on the field.